G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you're having a great week. Now thank you for all the support on yesterday's video and I'm feeling better today than I did yesterday and hopefully every day from here on I'm feeling a little bit better until I have to go back onto the poison. But legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over and we do have a lot of maps to look at today, some geolocated footage as well, as we do know that the battle for another city is beginning. We'll also look at some strikes down in Crimea, but the main bulk of this video today, we're going to speak about Russia's exercise in Belarus, exercise Zapad, what took place, what this means, a major military exercise, but then we need to look at the Baltic states, we need to look at Washington, at America, and how dedicated to these states is the US, how set in stone is NATO. So we've got a fair bit to go over on that. We're going to look at a fair bit of text in some books too around why NATO and the EU is important to America, why America is existentially important for those alliances, and we'll go down some of the fractures we may be seeing, the importance, but we're also going to go over how attritional war is fought, why it is fought this way in different structures, and then get an idea of why Russia is doing the exercises in Zapad that we have seen, where there are some shortfalls in the Russian military. So a fair bit to go over, don't worry, we'll get there in the end. So firstly, we're actually going to start on the map. So treat for you today. So of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014. Any red check that is confirmed by the Ukrainian Ministry of ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. As you'll see today, a little bit around the Velika Novosilka front line, or the Huliopol front line, we'll call it. And that's where we're going to come down into first off the bat. So you see a little bit of ground made to the south of Berezove and around Novinka as well. But we have Kalinivsky tier 2. And this is where we're going to talk about today, because it is likely that Kalinivsky has come under Russian control today. But what we can see is this front line, you can see where this Ukrainian map is showing it. You can see the porosity that it's showing and a lot of grey zones, sometimes as deep as 20 kilometres. But the way this war is being fought, it more likely is moving in little bits and pieces, like say moving to the west and exploiting north and south, because you don't want to get vertically enveloped by artillery, and drones come under that heading of artillery. So let's have a look at the Syriac maps in and around this sector here. So on this front line, in the last 48 hours, Russian army captured new trench system northwest of Berezove and entered Kalinivsky. So northwest of Berezove and capturing Kalinivsky. Now, we do have geolocated footage today here. Now, there's been 3 or 4 flags go up through Kalinivsky. I've just got the 2-1 in the center and the westernmost extreme geolocations here, but there are a few, and this is just one of the geolocated flags here as well. So there's been multiple go up, but I can't be bothered drawing multiple arrows. So likely that this area, well, there's at least grey zone 100% out to about here. So some 3.8, maybe 4 kilometres behind where the red control is on this map. And as we have been saying, this Velika Novosilka front line, this Huliopol, this southern area down here, this has been moving a lot faster than everywhere else on the map. So we've picked up out of here. Then we're going to, you can see where these pockets have been developed. And we're going to come into this pocket here, this Konstantinivka pocket, and this is very important here as well. So a couple of areas to look out for is Konstantinivka itself, Stopochki, Predichny too, and you can see this depth of secondary pockets. So you have the Katerinivka pocket and the Kurdiamivka pocket here too. So let's open up this. Now, firstly, let's look at Mr. Playfra. He does a fantastic job on his maps. With all of my sources that I show, please go and support them, not only through following, but if you are in a position to financially support as well. He says this: Russian forces consolidated in the Dasha village of Yahidka in Konstantinivka. Now, it is really possible to say that the battle for the city has started. So he is saying that the battle for the city has begun. So the labeling on this map, it won't show it, but it's out into this direction here. So let's bring back up his map just to confirm exactly where this is. We have Alexandro Shultney. You can see If you yourself have a look at some of these reservoirs that are coming down. So it's right up into about where my cursor is at the moment. So if Mr. Playfer is correct, and he has a great reputation, some 5 kilometres advancement from Alexandria, shortly in this direction, and he's saying, as per I'm guessing the title of this video, that the battle for this city has begun, and this is a very major area. We do know the logistics in and out of here are very limited at the moment due to Russia's longer range drones, same as in Pokrovsk. So keep an eye on this, and this could develop quickly. Now we'll have a look on the Syriac maps. Now, he's showing similar direction. These are those reservoirs we spoke of. But where we're interested in this today is just to the east of this, right around this Stepochke, Predechne, that he's saying all this area, see where this tree line is in here? Basically, if you were to draw where my cursor is coming down in here, that this whole secondary pocket, as I said it before, that is closing up according to Mr. Syriac maps. Now, we'll move just to the west of here, and of course, we have Pokrovsk. So we have Pokrovsk actual, the pocket in here, and then what we call the Pokrovsk East, if you will, really Pokrovsk North, but this Kucherov Yar, Novoshakovka area, and this is somewhere very difficult for everyone to get their head around what is actually occurring in here. And if you're confused about this, trust me, you're not alone. There's probably commanders on the ground in here who don't know exactly day to day exactly where the front is actually sitting, again with the porosity in here and the liquidity of how quickly things are changing. So firstly, let's look at Mr. Syriac maps. You can see this movement down in here on the base of where this has come out. And this is in the direction of, we have Nikolaevka, and then we have Boykivka. So Boykivka sitting down in here. And this is where Syriac is showing where the Ukrainian forces are undercutting, threatening a cut-off of this area. But more clearly is Mr. Thorkill 65. And he does a great job on this, but the Polish to English translation can be a little bit shit, so I've just had to fill in some little bits in here. So just to give you an idea, this is what he is showing here. Movement down in and around Boykivka as we zoom in. So Boykivka down in here, and Novotoretsk as well, that this is where the base of this is sitting. So almost just to the east exactly of where the deep state is showing, and where the Russians and the Ukrainians are pushing around Pankivka, Mayak area, as well as where Novoshakovka is too. So he's not showing that it is as north as deep state is showing, but he still shows that there's not a cutoff, and this is Mayak sitting down in here. Again, it can be very difficult to get your head around, but let's read what he has said. The situation of the so-called cauldrons to Radov, a Russian blogger, thoroughly viewing the Sentinel in places where Radov marks these alleged Ukrainian counterattacks and their supposed advances in the area, the so-called cauldrons, there's zero traces of fighting in these areas. So from satellite imagery, there's no traces of fighting. I don't even feel like writing or repeating about the status of Nikolaevka, that sits down in the south, anymore. Old craters from FAB glide bombs from July are quietly overgrowing there, so like grass on them. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are actually countering-attacking in the area of the so-called cauldrons and regaining territory. So down around where the base of some of these areas are. Radov marks nothing. So where Ukraine is actually counterattacking, the Russian bloggers are saying nothing, and vice versa. For example, Sentinel, between these dates, Russian strong point of Novoshakovka, so Novoshakovka right in here, of where Ukraine's actually counterattacking. Conclusion, Radov, like the rest of the Russian war correspondents, has no idea what is happening in the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka area and is making things up out of thin air. They have been cut information from there. It's the same with Ukrainian accounts from Osman officer, or Deep State probably has a ban. So Deep State ban on exactly what is actually happening down in here. We have seen Deep State under pressure previously, and what he says is there is basically a media blackout from the Russians and the Ukrainians in this sector. Therefore, the amount actually coming out of here, from footage to geolocations to imagery, like satellite or photographic imagery, to maps, is incredibly limited and very, very difficult to actually know what is happening, if things are cut off, where things may not be cut off, where even the sides are pushing. But I hope that just gives some idea of what could be happening here. Now we'll come down into Pokrovsk actual, the pocket that is developed in here, and of course buying into the attritional nature of warfare, holding this pocket open and making it incredibly costly. Some advancements just down around this southern area. So on this front line, series of trenches begun towards Novopavlivka. So down in the south, we have Novopavlivka in here, this area filling in. I believe there's a slight grey zone. Yes, slight grey zone increase down in this sector as well. Then we have the second Syriac maps update around here. Russian army begun assault in the district of Pevdeni. So just in the south of Pokrovsk, in and around these areas, that this is where, according to Syriac, where Russia is pushing at the moment. Now, again, as I've said, given the nature of the war at the moment, the attritional war is not won or lost by kilometre squares. I don't see it being worth the cost to push right up on massive into Pokrovsk while you've got this pocket open and Ukraine is committed to pushing more and more forces in and out of here on rotation as well, where your drones, your artillery, everything else can vertically envelop these forces. So let's pick up out of here. We do have now just our miscellaneous maps that don't need their own folder. Let's come into the Siversk pocket that has been developed. And we have Vreminka in here. You can see where this train line runs in here. Now, this is, in my opinion, not confirmed advancement, but definitely grey zone. So actually, let me show you the geolocation first. So just here, so just outside in these tree lines, just in here, what we see is this is just one part of the footage, but this is a Russian soldier here throwing in a satchel with explosives in it, maybe a TM62 anti-tank mine, something like that, throwing in like a satchel explosive and blowing up some of these dug in Ukrainian positions. There's multiple times throughout the video that this occurs. Now, what I will say is the reason I believe this is grey and not red, this area looks like the moon. It would be basically impossible to hold this area. You'd have to exploit beyond it. I don't know how long the Ukrainian guys have been in this area because rotations in and out of here could be absolutely impossible. So it's definitely grey length and into here, but it just looks like a moonscape. It's unbelievable in there. Now, let's come up into the Terny Chandralahove front line. Any changes on this? No changes on this map today, but we have Chandralahove Serezhne in here, and this is Syriac again. Now he is showing Chandralahove, he says, has come under Russian control, and between Serezhne and Chandralahove, that this is more flattened out. As we've spoken about, the nature of the war it doesn't mean you won't, but you may not end up with these like large pushing fingers. That more would show something like a maneuver aspect. And the last update we have, somewhere not being shown, but remember yesterday I showed you the Konstantinivka pocket, incorrect, the Kupiansk pocket up here, and then we had this area, this Milove front line, which day after day Syriac had been showing changes on, all the way to Odradne down in here, what I believe was about 7 kilometres, about 7 kilometres different. Now, today, Syriac is showing further changes again, new advances between Milove and Odradne. This is Odradne to here, this is Milove up here, showing more exploitation advances in this direction too. Is this a primary axis? No. Is it an alternative axis? No. What I believe it is drawing Ukrainian forces away from those areas where Russia does want to make more ground and exploit. This is the opportunity given to you if you are the larger force. Now, what we have seen over the past weeks is a number of Ukrainian successful long-range FPV strikes down into Crimea against air defense, against radars, against GLONASS systems, and against helicopters as well. Now, we have a little bit of footage today also. Now, the concerning part of this footage for the Russians should not be what is actually being lost, in my opinion, especially in this video. It is that these long-range FPVs are being able to operate with a lot of freedom of movement down here. So firstly, we see a Mi-8 helicopter. Looks like it is hit on the top rotors here as well. Again, getting a battle damage assessment is always very difficult on this. But then we see an interesting vehicle being hit. Now, this is a BE-12. This is the world's last operational, I believe, airship, whatever they call them, but not amphibious, that's the wrong word, but like a plane that can land on the water. But what we see is there's no propellers on this. We see it hit right in the middle of the body. And then we do see on this second one hit here, there is a prop on starboard, but there's not one on the port side. Now, it is being massively talked up, the importance of these. Now, the Mi-8, that is an important hit. But the BE-12, this is likely for the Ukrainian GUR who's operating these drones, a target of opportunity rather than a deliberate target for the drone operators. In my opinion, there is no way in the world they put these long-range drones, the capability that you have to put into the air of that, and the operators and the time and the effort and all of this to hit these BE-12s. No, this was an opportune target. It's there, and hit it. Because given the nature of the equipment Russia has down in Crimea, this would be very bottom of the list of things to hit, from S-400s to some old shitty antique plane. Why I say it's more of a target of opportunity is you can't find another target, or your more primary targets are being jammed, so you don't want to waste a drone, you go for something. Now, the GUR, they say this is the first destruction of BE-12s in history. The BE-12 Chaker amphibious aircraft are equipped with expensive equipment designed for detecting and combating submarines. Now, the first destruction in history. This tells us a bit. Ukraine has had the capability to hit these for years. They've taken down things like A-50s. Trust me, these are not as important. So if it's the first, that tells us a bit. Both are missing propellers, one on just one side, and realistically, these are not important aircraft. This is a relic and have been superseded not once, not twice, but multiple times by manned and then unmanned systems. And I do enjoy seeing these aircraft that we've never heard about before, no one could even name previously, now that this is decisive to Russia's ground-to-war effort. But what I say is the big thing that we're seeing in this is nothing to do exactly what is being hit. It's the operation of these long-range drones right down into that area. Okay, so let's talk about exercise Zapad, and let's talk about the Baltic states, or the states with what I would refer to as, and will to, small dog syndrome. The real yappy, loud knowing, backed by larger dog or by the US as well. So let's have a look at this. And there is a lot of tension. Now, this Financial Times article, we're going to go through them, we're going to go through some books, is titled "Putin is playing a dangerous game with NATO." How committed is NATO to defence of the Baltic states? That was the question Putin was indirectly posing when Russian fighter planes violated Estonian airspace last week. Now, this isn't actually as clear-cut as that, but we're not investigating that today. NATO's public position is unequivocal. The 32-country alliance will defend every inch of its territory. The commitment is on display at Estonia's Tapa military airbase with multiple planes, tanks, etc. Their public position is, if anyone's attacked, we are all attacked and we're all going. But there's always been a little bit of questioning about this. The troops in Tapa are trained to repel a full-scale Russian attack. But Western strategic planners think it is more likely that Russia would initially proceed incrementally, mounting small, ambiguous operations designed to test NATO's reactions in unity. So inching your way in, dipping your toe in the water, edging in, seeing what you'll actually do. Because this is you're never going to trade Frankfurt for New York. And this was said back in the Cold War, was, yeah, Article 5 exists on paper, but has it really ever been really tested? And there are some real overhanging questions on this. Last week's violation of Estonian airspace fits that pattern. And again today, that we did see drones flying over, whose airspace was it? I'll put it on the screen here. Particularly since it followed a large incursion of Russian drones into Poland that previous week. Some of the drones were shot down by NATO aircraft, and allies since deployed more planes to the eastern frontier, but not all of them were shot down. NATO will discuss how to respond to the Estonian incursion later this week. There are some in the alliance who argue that in future NATO should shoot down Russian planes that violate alliance airspace, but others, particularly in the US, believe that it would be a dangerous escalation. Now, why is NATO and EU important both ways, from the US into the European states and the European states into the US? Well, the European states basically get very, very cheap defence. And Henry Kissinger's world order, we're going to go through some Mearsheimer and some Iskander Riemann as well today. So long as strategic nuclear weapons were the principal element of Europe's defence, the objective of European policy was primarily psychological, to oblige the United States to treat Europe as an extension of itself in an emergency, and that giving up some of your sovereignty of military is very cheap administration into having US nuclear deterrence and US power. But why is it important the other way? And you can see the isolationist Americans being like, well, America should just war with America and fuck off the European states. But the US has every reason, from history to geopolitics, to bolster the EU and prevent it from drifting off into a geopolitical vacuum. The US, if separated from Europe in politics, economics and defence, would become geopolitically an island off the shores of Eurasia. And Europe itself could turn into an appendage to the reaches of Asia and the Middle East, and some very powerful players developing in those areas. So that gives a little bit of a baseline of why this is important. Let's continue on this FT article. Russia may gradually ramp up its provocations to test these latent divisions within NATO. One long-discussed scenario is an incursion of Russian ground troops into one of the Baltic states, perhaps on the pretext of defending ethnic Russians. The Kremlin's ultimate goal is to demonstrate that NATO's Article 5 mutual security guarantee is worthless. If the Russians could do that, then they might try and pick off small European states one by one without ever having to take on the combined might of NATO. And as we said in the first slide on this, yes, on paper, but has it ever been tested by a nuclear power? Uncertainty about Washington's response is the key to Moscow's probing. The US provides about 40% of NATO's military assets in Europe and some of its most advanced capabilities. Now, this is correct, but not the whole story. 40% of assets, it's 80% plus of firepower and almost all of the nuclear deterrence. But when it says in some of its most advanced capabilities, even just down to GPS, to the satellites, to then your Starlinks, to whatever, the US is significantly more than 40%. And if you were to look at manufacturing capability, economy, all of this, massively, massively important. There are also some American troops in the Baltic states. HIMARS unit recently conducted training at this base we spoke about before. But if the Russians ever staged a major incursion into Estonia or another NATO member, there are obvious questions about how Donald Trump would respond. Okay, there's questions about Trump because he's in the office at the moment. There's been questions for a long time about the US in general. This gentleman here, I'm not going to try and pronounce, but he's the former foreign minister of Lithuania, put it to this gentleman last week: if there is an incursion, an attack, what can Putin expect? The American Sixth Fleet coming into the Baltics, or a call to meet in Alaska? What can we really expect here? Just beneath the surface, there is real tension between the Trump administration and the Baltic allies. In Washington, I've heard complaints about the Estoniaization of European foreign policy, a country which is 0.25%, I believe, of total European GDP, but has incredible power with, of course, Kaja Kallas, the foreign policy chief, being Estonia's former prime minister. So a very, very tiny state, but having not complete, but a lot of power over this Estoniaization, which is being spoken about. And there's people in Germany and France too, the real behemoth powers in Europe, who are saying, there's a lot of, you have the equal power to us, but not in real politic senses. In parts of the Trump administration, the Balts are regarded as dangerously aggressive in their attitude to Putin. At a recent high-level Pentagon meeting, Baltic officials were accused of being ideological in their opposition to Russia, and this is, in layman's terms, sort of small dog syndrome. We see how Estonia or Lithuania talk about the war, about Russians going to war, blah, 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 blah. The only reason there's any of that rhetoric is because of Germany, France, US. Sorry, Brits. You were Great Britain, it's now just Britain. The suspicion between the Balts and the US is mutual. In the corridors of Estonian Foreign Ministry last week, just outside the offices of most senior officials, I saw a large reproduction of the vote tally from February's UN debate on Ukraine, in which the US voted with the Russians. The message seemed clear. Don't assume that Trump's America is on our side. Again, don't ever assume that great states are on anyone's side. Again, great states, America, does not have permanent friends or enemies. They have strategic interest. And again, their primary strategic interest at the moment is to try and at least quell the rise of China. So that's where you need to look through a lot of lenses at the moment. And their primary interest is the survival of the US state as a dominant hegemon, or at least as a regional hegemon. The largest European countries are much more consistent than the Trump administration in their insistence on the need to counter Russian aggression. But they're also very nervous about the idea of fighting Russia without the US alongside them. Witness the agonizing about whether a European reassurance force could ever be deployed to Ukraine without an American backstop behind it. No one is willing to deploy anyone without the US. We know this has been clear as day, and we look at the production rates of shells and tanks and whatever in Russia compared to Europe, and if you drop off the US, those production rates look even worse, okay? But while NATO has to deal with uncertainty, so do the Russians. Trump is so volatile that his reactions in international crises cannot be predicted. Many Trump watchers assume that he would never authorise US participation in the bombing of Iran, and yet that is precisely what he did earlier this year. Again, war with Russia, rise of China, Iran is a very different beast to what we're seeing here as well. Even if America stood aside in a crisis in the Baltics, the British, French, Germans and Canadians all have troops deployed there that have pledged to fight. Poland and Finland, well-armed nations, and know their own security is closely entwined with the fate of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. They too would probably defend the Baltic states. That is, at least on paper, it's very likely that way, but have we ever seen it really tested? And what we spoke about, if you pick off a state at a time. And again, we're seeing rhetoric versus reality coming into play. It would be a reckless gamble for Putin to test the will of the NATO countries to defend the alliance's eastern frontier. Unfortunately, as the world discovered when Russian forces advanced on Kiev 22, Putin is more than capable of making reckless gambits. This I disagree with. Misjudgment is not a reckless gamble. I believe that Putin's judgment and the weighing up of the advance into Ukraine is in line with the American assessments. The American assessments, the Western assessments is what gave us that 3-day idea, guys. It wasn't a reckless... Did it misjudge? Yeah, we saw that. We're now 3.5 years into war. But it's different from then saying it was a gamble. And in Professor John Mearsheimer's book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which you should read, on page 218, he talks about this. But what I've done is I've written just down this, because it's over a couple of pages, but it starts at 218, but I've written this down. And this is a historical reference to this. There is a myth that Operation Barbarossa by the Germans and the Soviet Union was a one-way suicide mission. This is only in hindsight. At the time, there was solid strategic reasoning to believe the German blitzkrieg method may be able to dissipate the hollowed-out Soviet forces from Stalin's purges. In the end, the Germans made the wrong decision, but not an irrational one. And this is what I will say in this. Now, did Putin and then misjudge? Did the Pentagon misjudge? Did everyone misjudge? Yes. Was it the wrong decision in hindsight 3.5 years on? Maybe. But was it irrational? No. There was real thinking that our side of the forces, their side of the forces, we may win very quickly. Okay, so we do need to look at that rationality as well. Now, this is going to go a little bit further into what we're seeing Russia, the Belarusians, and even some Indians actually training as well. And Rusi talks about this in an article. The Wartime Zapad 2025, Russia's Strategic Adaptation and NATO. So what we're seeing is Russia is conducting, or has conducted, a major exercise as the war is still going on. This is a deliberate and rational adaptation to the immense human and material costs of the ongoing large-scale war in Ukraine and the persistent strain of international sanctions. So the way that Zapad 25 is different to the years prior, but also through lessons learnt in the war too, and where there are some areas in the Russia's strategy, especially in their initial period of war, the IPW, that is lacking. The exercise works as a multi-layered instrument of a state in wartime. Even though not fully mobilised, politically it fostered a perception of resolved continuity to both domestic and international audiences, strengthening the Russian and Belarusian closeness and deploying calibrated, low-resource deterrent messaging. So we're still able to conduct exercise while this is going on. Militarily, it worked as a field laboratory where Russia stress tested and refined its IPW, the initial period of war playbook, incorporating direct lessons from the Ukrainian battlefield. The focus this time was on high leverage capabilities, such as long-range precision fires, integrated air and missile defense, the IAMD, I'll just use that later on, and EW, electronic warfare, while conserving mass and material that are critically needed in Ukraine. This focus directly reflects the frictions and vulnerabilities exposed in the conflict. So brutal command, control, logistics, etc. But what it's trying to do is where there's definitely drawbacks and hollow points for the Russian, at least this initial period of war, being what we saw in the beginning of 22. 2025 iteration of this unfolded under unprecedented circumstances. Russia engaged in a large-scale, high attrition war in Ukraine with the economy placed on war footing. No, it's not. The economy is more on war footing. Is it complete war footing? No, it is not. See my interview with Richard Connolly for that. While Zapad 21 was characterised by conspicuous mass and tempo, showcasing a massive conventional war scenario that was later seen as a prelude to the earlier stages of the initial invasion of Ukraine, Zapad 25 was markedly different. Open sources suggest that it was more compact, distributed across multiple training areas, and consciously designed to remain below the key transparency threshold. So any of these exercises over 13,000 people meet over a transparency threshold. So try to be below this, but you can actually fudge these numbers a little bit. This scaled-down approach was not an abandonment of the initial period of war doctrine, but a tactical adaptation of its inability to pursue the same doctrine at the scale of Zapad 21 while simultaneously sustaining a protracted war. So this is going on at the same time. We'll get a little bit deeper into this. Now, the design and constraints was a direct reflection of Russia's battlefield experience in Ukraine, serving as a feedback loop for adapting doctrine and operational art. So lessons learned in blood and adopting this in a field, a laboratory, if you will. Now, this Vienna document threshold is 13,000, but you can modularize parallel events to avoid mandatory verification while training at strategic scale. Do I think they'd give a shit? No, I wouldn't. Now, Russia's largest weakness that we have seen is not mass. It was those initial period of war. No one knew exactly in the modern day, though, how IPW really looks on this scale. The central doctrinal focus of the IPW, which aims to disorganise an adversary through rapid deep strikes against operational command and control. C2, air bases, the IAMD nodes, logistics hubs, and railway choke points. So this is the doctrinal focus, and what I will say is this is where we saw Russia's biggest weakness, in my opinion. The exercise's focus on these elements is a direct consequence of the war in Ukraine and the lessons Russia has been forced to learn. This exercise explicitly incorporated the realities of modern high-intensity conflict. Russia will use tactics that compensate for weaknesses exposed in Ukraine, such as use of glide bombs to overcome limited air superiority. This is somewhat creating a false narrative of the glide bombs. Now, would the glide bombs still be used even with full air superiority? Yes. Would they be used closer? Maybe. But the glide bombs are a shitload cheaper than anything that is more of a targeted weapon system like a missile. So not really. That's why we see development of that. But limited air superiority, yeah. And what we have seen is that in modern conflict, air superiority cannot be assumed, although these people getting paid $1 million a year in these senior command positions assume air superiority. And what we saw in Yemen was planes falling off the side of fucking ships and unable to gain air superiority. Much less of a force deployed from the Yanks there, much less of an adversary as well, though. So I don't think in any war we're going to see air superiority if we go up against any other large state. You may see no one in the air or everyone in the air. Now, it also practiced deploying ground-based air defense, electronic warfare, ISR capabilities, drones, etc. Persistent problem encountered on the front lines. Exercise also addressed enduring vulnerabilities in the Russian military, including its centralized staff-centric command and control system, which limits initiative in fluid combat conditions, its high casualty costs for amassed fires, and incremental assaults. Now, this is somewhat moving where, though, the Russian-Soviet doctrine now is a hybrid actually is. Now, having a staff-centric command and control, more centralized, vertical, it does reduce individual soldiers and command initiative. Thing is, to have individual soldier and low-level command initiative, you need very, very highly trained forces, so your ability to replace those in attritional war is very limited. Say, to replace an NCO, a corporal, a sergeant in the British, Australian, Canadian, American, Polish, etc. forces is going to take 6 to 10 years to have someone at that who can conduct that doctrine, use those systems, etc., etc., etc. But they're going to have more initial period of warfare, initiative, and capability. But that capability, once that's lost, you won't be able to spin that up fast enough to be able to conduct this. This is where the Russians and the Soviet doctrine operated in a less initiative, more staff-centric, but it can replace losses and absorb losses much, much faster and will develop better over time, where we reduce over time. And there's a point in there somewhere of where one system is better than the other. What the Soviet system, at least, it predicted that you would get in a war is if there was a large-scale war, that over the length of the war, at a couple of years, you'd end up creating like a pseudo NCO corps of guys who have survived in that system and end up in leadership positions. So It just says that, like, this is all bad. In my opinion, as someone who was in the Australian Army, and I believe the Australian Infantry, due to the way Australia is a very small, massive country with a lot of money, is, I believe, the best trained infantry in the world. You could fight me on that, okay, whatever. But very highly trained infantry, I think in many cases is actually overtrained because there's no ability to replace guys. If Australia was losing guys at 500 or 1,000 guys a day, we would have a few days of capability. And even if you start recruiting, you need years and years to replace these guys, not weeks or months, etc. I think there's a baseline over training to a degree. You still need to be able to replace people. This is where you even see weapon systems that I think a lot of the Western weapon systems, although they are superior in a lot of ways are superior, they're so advanced, the ability to actually fix it in the battlefield or train guys in battlefield scenarios is impossible also. Now, I have another slide and book to go over in a second, but I believe it's in this one here. Yes, sorry. Assessments and strict considerations of Zapad. NATO must be prepared to exploit predictable key vulnerabilities and improve several areas. Apparently, in Russia's initial period of war strategy relies early on deep strikes against critical infrastructure, C2 nodes, airbase logistics hubs, and what NATO needs to do is harden these areas because this is where it wants to sort of cripple and blind straight off the bat. Accelerating integration and ISR capabilities is the center of gravity, or the Schwerpunkt, if you would, for contemporary defensive strategy against Russia's IPW playbook. Now, this I think is a little bit misleading. Yes, there's this initial capability, but I think everyone in like the senior analysis space knows that you will not win a war of strategic strikes in the opening days, that it's rarely determinative of who wins or loses war. NATO's biggest weakness that I see by a fucking mile is the non-acceptance of prolonged attrition as the normal, that this is the rule, not the exception to war, that even against middling states, against less powerful states, that you will end up in a protracted, prolonged conflict. Ukraine has dragged Russia into a protracted, prolonged conflict with what has happened as a much lesser power, at least by bodies, although we won't consider support behind the scenes, if you will. This is, I think, the biggest weakness of military planners. And Mr. Iskander Riemann, who speaks about in this fantastic book, Planning for Protraction, I just wish that he would fucking apply the lessons he talks about so elegantly in this to the war in Ukraine. But he speaks about this in pages 19 and beyond. The opening phases of high-intensity conflict are critical, but they are rarely determined if temporarily crippled opponents can recuperate. The American way of war, with its intense emphasis on speed and precision firepower, can occasionally appear excessively geared towards fighting wars as if they were battles, and thus risk confusing the winning of campaigns or small-scale actions with the winning of wars, and not being able to operationally absorb. So again, not a non-holistic approach to war as an entire sequence of events, rather than just winning singular events. Throughout history, short war thinking has often run aground on jagged shoulders of political reality, with states repeatedly underestimating the amount of pain and devastation that determined adversaries could absorb prior to even contemplating surrender. This goes back into the calculations around Putin's invasion was not irrational. It may have been the wrong, what's the term I'm looking for? It may have been they may have misjudged, but it was not irrational at the time to believe that Russia would have had a shorter victory. Okay? We speak about this. No. Next slide. This is page 33. Protracted conflicts are extended cycles of action, counteraction, and experimental learning. As a result, the ability of a belligerent to adapt rapidly and evisively, whether in terms of training, tactics, or overarching military strategy, is critical. One should not necessarily assume that a competitor with little experience in one aspect of warfare is incapable, under the galvanizing pressure of combat, of rapidly overcoming its earlier deficiencies. And Mr. Riemann also says in this book that whatever we have initially is likely incorrect. We just need the ability to adapt. Okay? What else in this? Demonstrating... this is important in here. The exercise was showcased through narratives and propaganda as well, showing that this is happening. Now, we have Russia's claims and actual capabilities been demonstrating alliance cohesion through well-publicized parallel exercises and forward sustainment drills can effectively counter Russian narratives and introduce uncertainty for Russian planners. So by showing that there is cohesion in NATO, this can throw a span in the works to the Russian planners, and they might go, fuck, they actually may all come to the table if we keep chipping away at this. The central takeaway is that Russia's initial period of war playbook is not static. The focus on long-range fires, the IAMD dual electronic cognitive shaping points deliberate effort to build up an overwhelmed defender strike complex and exploit opportunities on the ground. The war has exposed systematic vulnerabilities, logistical fragilities, command brittleness, and economy on unsustainable militarized footing. Again, speaking to Richard and others, the economy, it may be less hot than it was, but it doesn't seem unsustainable from everything that I'm seeing. But again, this, I think, is adding the way I think America more sees war, or the West, as far as having this large, complex strike capability and victory quickly through that. The way that we saw the Soviets not only train forces, build equipment, and also then the Russians fight, more goes into trying to lengthen and draw into a prolonged attritional capability. That's how the forces are trained. That's how the weapons were made. That's why a T-series tank is significantly easier to produce more of, say T-34, than a German Panzer, and through with forces and the ability to absorb. So I disagree with that there. For NATO, Zapad 25 underscores a fundamental requirement for a nuanced threat assessment. The alliance must not be misled by a downscaled optics of the exercise. Instead, must recognise the exercise's focus on high-end capabilities represents a persistent, long-term threat. So not just, hey, nothing, this all sucks, blah, blah, blah. As soon as to say that this is a real threat. The exercise is a stark reminder that while the war in Ukraine has imposed significant costs on Russia, it has also created a more adapted, albeit constrained military that remains intent on achieving its strategic objectives. Again, this is assuming a lot of strategic objectives in here as the Baltics. But again, yes, we do need to accept that this war has had significant costs on Russia, on its economy, on its people, on its manufacturing capabilities. But also, there's ways that it has become more independent, also more dependent on China and developing sovereign capability too, and has adapted to this. There may be constraints, but we still need to take all of that into account as well, and not just pay off all of this. Because if you do if you act like, or what I will say is the chaos approach, or the chaos approach, or the Estonianization of this assumption that Russia is now a gone power, there's nothing left, blah 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 blah. What we were told in 22, then we end up in 25. In the situation we're in, going, hang on, now we have Big Ruta, fucking Mark Rutte, telling us they're pumping out a couple of thousand tanks a year and producing 5 to 10 times the amount of shells they're producing. Things aren't adding up here, broski. This is the problem that you get in with an over-narrativized war rather than accepting and looking at realistic. And what has led to this? The amount of analysts behind the scenes who share information with me because they're like, if I share this amount of hate that I'm going to get, or it's not going to get published in a think tank or in the media, blah, 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 even though it may be correct, because there seems to be a narrative you're allowed to speak in, even in like analytical academic circles, which is fucking frightening, if you will. So this idea that Russia's is gone forever. Remember back in the day, maybe be repeated by me, that Russia's strategically defeated for 50 years. We heard that in 22. Now we're hearing all these threats to the Baltics. Now we're hearing big fucking Ruta talking about fucking Germany. And you're like, hang on. Firstly, this is Schrodinger's Putin, or Putin's paradox. Unable to take this area in Ukraine, but then able to march on Munich. But you do need to take all of this seriously. And where Washington is looking, America will look out for America first. Raison d'etat. Even if that means for short term, making alliances with ideological enemies, as per we saw in the Second World War, when there is a greater threat of power balance. China is the threat. And if that means America has to go, hey, fucking Kaya, you're going to crack the shits at us, we're going to try and draw Russia back into our sphere of influence somewhat, or try and draw away from China or whatever to try and quell that rise, it'll be done. And I think people understand the reality, how America acts so much as a realist on the international stage. Legends, a lot fucking in that. I apologise. Anyway, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.